Kelly, you want me to go and get started?
Sure.
Yeah, great. Well, welcome everyone. Here we are again, the Arlington branch of the NAACP on a Wednesday night in this virtual space. And we thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be with us. First, let me say, if you just come in on the call, please mute your phone. Your device. It keeps out a lot of the background noise. You probably hear my house phone, right? But I can't help that. We are excited to have everyone joining us tonight for the Arlington Fair Housing Conference. I want to thank Kellen and our housing committee for planning this event, and for Home of Virginia and the Equal Rights Center for co-sponsoring it with the NAACP Arlington branch. As you know, Arlington NAACP, we have invested and we are invested in advancing racial equity in the county housing policies and practices. This is in our Constitution. We seek to eliminate discrimination in housing. So tonight's presentation will address a few things. We're going to address fair housing rights. We're going to talk about enforcement, government obligations. We're going to talk about some regional efforts to address fair housing impediments. We're going to talk about segregation in schools and neighborhoods, and the existing gaps in access to opportunities for Black and Brown residents. So again, a little bit of housekeeping as we get started. Please stay muted if you're not a presenter tonight. You can submit questions in the chat and throughout the event, or you can use the raise hand function. The panel will answer your questions as need be. And this event, as you probably already noticed, is recorded, and it will be made available to the public on our Facebook and on our YouTube channel, which we ask everyone to subscribe to. So with that being said, listen, I think you're going to learn a lot tonight. I look forward to learning a good bit. I thank you for your time and your attention. We're going to turn this program over now to the chair of the Housing Committee, Kellen McBeth. Kellen?
Thanks, JD. Sorry, I was waiting for my camera to start up there. So I think we can jump right into our first presentation, which is going to be about fair housing in Virginia from Regina Cheney from Home of Virginia. And Wanda, if you could bring up the PowerPoint display as well for tonight. Thank you. And Wanda, if you could go to, I think it's the third slide. Yep, there we go. Regina?
All right, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. We have a busy night ahead, so I'm gonna go right into things. Again, my name is Regina Cheney. I'm with Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Virginia. Just a little bit about Home. We've been around for 50 years. We were founded 3 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. Our mission, Home's mission, is to ensure equal access to housing for all people in an effort to combat housing inequality, expand access, and to achieve our mission. We address all allegations of housing discrimination through our investigations and litigations of individual and systemic discrimination. We conduct research internally and externally to better understand how housing can produce access to additional opportunities. We provide homeownership counseling and education and financial assistance in the form of down payment assistance to first-time home buyers in an effort to help families build generational wealth. We assist families to save their homes from foreclosure. We help families who have housing choice vouchers secure housing in low poverty areas. And that is in an effort to deconcentrate poverty. And we provide housing counseling, financial coaching, and financial assistance to families facing eviction via our eviction diversion program. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the Fair Housing Act that came about April 11th, 1968. The act itself prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of dwellings and in other housing related transactions based on what's called protected classes. And the protected classes in 1968, race, color, national origin, religion, and sex. And in 1988, the statute was amended to include familial status and disability. The overall purpose of the Fair Housing Law was to eliminate housing discrimination and to promote residential integration. Unfortunately, the racial disparities in the housing market between people of color and white families is greater today than it was 50 years ago. Next slide. So why is fair housing important? Next slide. I wanted to include this information. This is the Fair Housing Trends data from 2020. This data was put together by the National Fair Housing Alliance. It was actually collected from private, nonprofit fair housing organizations across the country, HUD and FAP agencies, and the Department of Justice. In 2020, there were nearly 30,000 fair housing complaints. And you can see disability tops them all. We have more disability complaints than any other protected class. As you can see on the left, those are primarily the 7 federal protected classes, and you can look at the number of cases that came in 2020. On the right, those other fair housing complaints are other protected classes that are in other states. So all of the ones to the right are not protected classes in Virginia. But you can see some of the types of cases that were addressed certainly in 2020 and continue to this day. I think the one on the right that increased the most was harassment. In 2020, that actually increased about 37% from the previous year in 2019. Next slide, please. So I'll get right into protected classes. First of all, it's race, and that would be all races. Color, which is based on one's skin tone. National origin, that's because of the country or origin of a person or ancestry. And what's important with national origin is that all citizens are, all residents are protected, not just citizens. Sex or gender is a protected class where there's sex or gender preferences, and there are limitations or a limited exception to this particular protection. For instance, when there's shared living quarters, such as roommates, so if there's a female who has a house or an apartment and she wants to share that, and she puts an ad in the paper that says females only, that is not a fair housing violation. The protected class of religion, that would be based on the chosen religion or the lack thereof. Familial status is a protection for families with children. And disability. Disability is described as a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. The 3 asterisks there indicate that there are additional protections for persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. So the additional protections in Virginia: elderliness, source of funds, sexual orientation, gender identity, and military status. Elderliness, actually, we've had that in Virginia for some time. That's a protection for persons who are 55 years or older. Source of funds, that is a protection for folks who actually have funds that may not be wages, So it's illegal to deny a person housing because of their source of income. When funds are provided by a person or provided on behalf of a person. This includes financial assistance, subsidy programs, benefits, etc., where the funds or program is administered by a governmental agency or non-governmental agency, doesn't matter. Sexual orientation, it's illegal to discriminate against a person for their actual or perceived heterosexuality, bisexuality, or homosexuality. This includes discrimination due to someone's physical appearance, their mannerisms, or the partner they choose to be with, or any self-identifying symbol or flag. Gender identity. It's illegal to discriminate against someone for their gender-related identity, appearance, or other gender-related characteristics with or without regard to the individual's designated sex at birth. And military status. This includes active military service members or veterans who served in the active military and who were discharged or released under conditions other than dishonorable. And there's also a protection for family members of active military service members or veterans. And certainly since these protected classes started in Virginia, the Virginia Fair Housing Office reported last month that their workload has quadrupled. So that's a true indication that we needed these protections here in Virginia. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a bit about what it looks like. What does the discriminatory behavior look like? Such as refusal to rent.
Regina, I think you need to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry.
I think you accidentally got muted.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay, sorry. Did we get the last slide?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're good. You were on
you're good.
refusal to rent.
Okay, so refusal to rent or sell, an outright denial or reluctance to provide service. An example of this would be refusing to rent to someone who had a housing trust voucher. Offering different terms and conditions. This would be an example of requiring additional screening or denying or limiting services or facilities. An example of this might be when some housing providers will increase the rent or change the rental amount when someone has a housing choice voucher. Or asking a male, refusing to do services or repair services for a male tenant as opposed to female tenants because they should know how to make the repair or do the repair. Or treating families who don't speak English different with regards to services with regards to repairs. That's something we've seen a lot in our office. Steering, that would be steering potential tenants to a less desirable apartment might be an example. Another example would be steering an African-American or a same-sex couple to the back of a housing community, but you have vacant units in the front of the community, but prefer to have them out of the way. Misrepresentation of the availability of housing, just basically saying we don't have anything at this time when there truly are units available. Advertising a preference, that would be written. That's oral or written statements that indicate a preference or limitation, and that is to include words, photographs, or symbols, such as this housing is not suitable for families, or no Section 8 allowed. To threaten, intimidate, coerce, or interference, to hold up or delay in the processing of an application, pressure or bullying, threatening statements, whether they be verbal or written. Because an example would be if a tenant has complained about repair that needs to be done, and the housing provider threatens to evict them if they continue. That's certainly against the law. Sexual harassment, certainly sexual harassment by housing providers is illegal under the Fair Housing Act as well as other federal laws. And we do see this too often where the housing providers asking for sexual favors and as a condition for maintenance repairs or to delete certain things like late fees or something like that. Next slide, please. I wanted to add this in because source of funds is certainly one of a new protected class in Virginia. And there's certainly, here's an indication of why this is in place and that some people weren't paying attention. But back in October, the Attorney General's office filed 13 separate lawsuits against 29 real estate companies that provided housing in the city of Richmond, Chesterfield, and Henrico counties. And basically they refused to accept housing choice vouchers, meaning they refused to rent to someone or provide housing for folks who had a voucher. An agreement was reached to settle those lawsuits. Some of the terms included a monetary relief exceeding $100,000, which when you really look at it, that's really a small amount of money given the number of real estate companies that were involved. And some of the other terms of the agreement are also there, which, to highlight properties to home seekers via marketing campaigns that includes vouchers are accepted. I know that right now the Virginia Fair Housing Office has probably about 30 more cases pending with regards to source of income, discriminatory allegations. Next slide, please. So what are some of the ongoing challenges? Well, certainly as we talk, as we will probably talk more about tonight, racial disparities in home ownership. The gap between Black and white household is, as I said earlier, the highest it's been in 50 years. African Americans continue to be denied mortgages at a disproportionately higher rate than whites. Another one is appraisal discrimination. Homes in neighborhoods with large concentration of African American families are appraised at a lower rate and lower market value. And that's across the country on an average of 23%, or about $48,000. And that's based on households of similar size and condition. There are some horror stories, certainly from 2021. The one that I like to talk about is out in San Francisco, a Black family had their home appraised. They had done some renovation, and when they got the appraisal back, they were certainly concerned that it was suspiciously low. And what they did was they were talking to some white friends, and the white friends agreed to go to the house, meet with the appraiser, and set the house up as if they lived there. The difference in the appraised value with the white family was $500,000. And when you're talking about generational wealth, and that was certainly would have been a denial of that generational wealth for that Black family had they not been suspicious and filed a complaint with regards to this appraisal. But that's just how those things happen. And that's been probably going on for years. But also another challenge is informational networking and discriminatory digital marketing. Now, because of the internet and social media, there are ways that people who advertise on social media, and I think it's called farming, that you can select criteria of where you want or how you want this advertisement listed or seen. And you can exclude certain groups of people in certain areas. That is a little difficult to investigate, but not impossible, because those investigations have taken place, particularly on Facebook, and lawsuits have been filed and settlements have been won. Certainly, we see a lot of housing challenges for families who don't speak English. Again, blanket bans for persons with criminal histories. Since the pandemic, there has been a lot of just blatant discriminatory acts that have taken place, certainly, like I said, since the pandemic. We've seen in our office an increase of discriminatory allegations against families with children. And again, the cost of housing, the whole issue of affordability with high rents, qualifying criteria, high deposits that make it difficult for low and moderate income families to secure decent housing. And oftentimes the cost of housing, the rent itself, or the qualifying criteria, or the amount of deposits are set to exclude certain people. So those things are, like I said, some of the things that we certainly see in our office. Next slide. I know we have a lot to go forth. That's our telephone number and our website. Pass it on over to Susie, and I look forward to being part of this conversation going forth. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Regina. If you want to go to the next slide, my name is Susie McClanahan. I'm the Fair Housing Rights Program Manager at the Equal Rights Center. And we're going to be now going over a couple major fair housing concepts. So next slide, please. As a bit of introduction to the Equal Rights Center, we're a civil rights organization based in Washington, D.C., and we seek to identify and eliminate discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations here in the D.C. region and nationwide. Next. The ERC can assist folks who are experiencing discrimination in housing throughout the region in a variety of ways. One is through advocating directly with the housing provider to try to address possible discrimination. Another, as Regina alluded to, is that we can assist people with submitting requests for reasonable accommodations or modifications, such as, having an emotional support animal in your home, transferring to a more accessible unit, getting an accessible parking space, things like that where you live. Next. We also assist people with filing housing discrimination complaints, either with HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or the local government agency. And we serve as people's advocates throughout the process so that they're better able to prevail on their housing discrimination claims. We also do accessibility site surveys where we look at multifamily housing, such as condominiums or apartment buildings that were built after March of 1991 to make sure they're in compliance with accessible design and construction requirements. And the last thing we do is civil rights testing. And so this is the first kind of concept that I want to go over. Civil rights testing involves trained individuals posing as interested applicants. You might have heard of this kind of as secret shopping, where we get a better idea of what's actually going on at a housing provider because we hold for all of their characteristics, but one specific identity. So to give an example, on the next slide, we have two individuals who are testers going into a property. And first, the white tester goes in and says that he's looking for a 1-bedroom unit, asks if there's any available. The agent says, yes, we have some, please get your application in soon. So he leaves and the black tester comes in 10 minutes later. And in this case, he asks for the same thing, a 1-bedroom unit. He's equally qualified and he asks if there's any units that are available. And she says, sorry, we don't have any vacant 1-bedrooms right now, which, in Arlington is highly possible. Housing goes very quickly, but this would be an indication that discrimination might be occurring based on race. You can go to the next slide. So that is civil rights testing. The next concepts I want to talk about are 3 terms that frequently can be confusing. So first, fair housing, which is what Regina was discussing, and that is housing free from discrimination. The second is affordable housing, and this simply refers to housing that is designed that is usually less expensive, where folks with lower incomes can afford to live. This is not the same thing as housing discrimination. And the third type is public housing. So public housing is a type of affordable housing. It is government run, and is public housing, for instance, are units that are owned by the government and rented to individuals with low incomes at a much lower rent rate so that they can afford to live there. So public housing is a type of affordable housing. Affordable housing and fair housing are separate, but they often overlap because affordable housing is frequently a fair housing issue. Because of the legacy of racism in the United States, there's huge wealth gaps between white people and people of color. And so frequently, for instance, in the district, we're seeing displacement of communities of color as they're getting pushed out further and further into the suburbs as DC and the surrounding areas become more and more expensive. So affordable housing is something that we need to consider the implications of as it relates to discrimination, but affordable housing and fair housing are not the same. There's also fair housing implications for where affordable housing is located. We frequently see affordable housing projects in low-income communities of color, whereas lots of times whiter, wealthier neighborhoods will actively push back, especially based on stereotypes of low-income folks of color. And so in this case, it's a fair housing issue because discrimination is at play as to where those affordable housing sites can go. But affordable housing in and of itself is not the same as the concept of fair housing. So I hope that's helpful. Also happy to answer further questions in the chat. Moving on to the next slide. The next thing I want to talk about is disparate impact. So there's two major types of housing discrimination. And the first type is what we usually think of, which is different treatment. And this is where, for instance, in the video we saw, where because of race, the agent treated the two testers differently. So this is direct, different treatment. But sometimes, even if we treat people the same, policies that seem neutral can have disproportionate impacts on specific communities. And so disparate impact refers to housing discrimination practices that seem neutral, like when you look at the policy or practice, but actually disproportionately harm a specific protected class, such as people of a certain race or national origin. So to give an example, on the next slide, a couple of years ago, the Equal Rights Center looked into criminal record screening practices at housing providers. And to give an example of different treatment, we had a Black tester and a white tester go in, and both disclosed they had a felony conviction on their record from 15 years ago. The agent told the Black tester, yeah, they won't approve you. In this case, they told the white tester, though, a third party makes the decision. It depends on the type of crime and how long ago it was. Now, these seem like very different policies. And so in this case, this is likely different treatment where the Black tester is being told one thing and a white tester is being told something different, even though they have the exact same conviction on their record. Next slide. An example of disparate impact would be a housing provider, for instance, might have a question as they fill out their application, which says, have you or any other applicant or occupant ever been convicted of a felony? And if you put yes, it tells you, we're unable to rent an apartment to you. There's nothing about race in this question. There's no way for the website to know the race of the person applying. But due to the history of racism in our criminal legal system, we know that people of color, and especially Black and Indigenous folks, are much more likely to get entangled in the system. So next slide. So what this means is that criminal record screening policies that are looking for anyone with a felony or anyone with a misdemeanor are going to disproportionately impact, especially looking at this chart in Virginia, Black folks with criminal records. It's going to entangle people of other races, but it's going to specifically target Black people. So this is going to be considered a disparate impact case. Next slide. Sorry, I keep forgetting I can't click. Thank you. The last term I want to discuss is affirmatively furthering fair housing, which we might have heard as AFFH. So AFFH refers to, in the Fair Housing Act, there is a requirement that federal agencies and recipients of federal funding affirmatively further fair housing. So this is in the original law in 1968. And as part of this, what that means is that government agencies, federal government agencies, and anyone that receives federal funding, so lots of cities, states, public housing authorities, departments of housing and community development, they must strive to dismantle historic patterns of racial segregation. They also need to work to preserve integrated housing that already exists, and they need to otherwise take meaningful steps to further the Fair Housing Act's purposes, besides merely refraining from discriminatory actions and banning others from such discrimination. And this matters because the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, but housing discrimination, both by the federal and local governments, as well as by private individuals, was rampant until that time. And so if we just halted housing discrimination at 1968, we're not undoing any of the harm that occurred until then. We're now just all of a sudden saying no further discrimination at this point. And it doesn't really recognize or address so much of the harm that happened until then. So this is really important in requiring both our government and both our federal government and also local government agencies at looking at what's going on to see how we can actually be undoing our history of harm. Next slide. So in 2015, the Obama administration passed the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. And so this was technically enacted by HUD. And as part of the rule, it introduced the Assessment of Fair Housing tool, which is confusingly abbreviated AFH as part of the AFFH rule. And it requires jurisdictions to certify that they're in compliance with this requirement of affirmatively furthering fair housing. In addition to requiring this compliance, they also created a standardized method for local jurisdictions to actually look at what their fair housing barriers are and the goals for addressing these barriers. So it helped make it clear as to what local jurisdictions should actually be doing in order to be in compliance with AFFH. This allowed jurisdictions to create more specific and precise fair housing goals, metrics, and timelines. And it also meant that they were engaging more with the communities in order to develop these goals. Next slide. That being said, it has been very confusing in the last few years as to what the status of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule is. Like I said, under the 1968 law, federal agencies and their recipients of federal funding do need to be affirmatively furthering fair housing, but until 2015, it was very murky as to what that actually meant. So the rule went into place in 2015, but HUD then suspended the rule in 2018. In 2021, HUD has partially reinstated the AFFH rule. So jurisdictions are required to certify compliance with that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing, but they are not required to go through the specific assessments to identify local barriers or goals. And what HUD said is that they plan to undertake a separate rulemaking process to actually update and institute a new fair housing assessment process for jurisdictions. That being said, many jurisdictions are still opting in to go through this process of assessing fair housing barriers and goals because they have found it so helpful in actually setting clear goals to address housing discrimination in their communities. So I think with that, that should lead us to our next topic. And last slide is just my contact information, I think. Yeah. So I'll put this in the chat and we can keep moving right along. Thank you, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Hillary Chapman and I'm COG's Housing Program Manager. I'm thrilled to be here with you to share a brief update on an important multi-year process to move the needle on housing equity in our region. So first, we can go to the next slide, please. For those of you who may not already be familiar with the Council of Governments, we're a nonprofit association whose members are comprised of 24 local governments from suburban Maryland, Northern Virginia, and the District of Columbia. And my role at COG is to support regional coordination on the shared challenges of housing affordability, fair housing, and homelessness. Next slide, please. So I think Susie just did a masterful job explaining about what the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule is and how local governments can comply with the Fair Housing Act. But just to make sure we're all clear, so there's a Council of Governments and 8 local participating governments are working together on a regional housing equity plan, or also known as the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, which is the HUD term. And so just make sure we're clear about what that is. We are working on a plan that will provide for meaningful actions to overcome historic patterns of segregation, promote fair housing choice, and foster inclusive communities free from discrimination. And what will go into this regional plan, sort of the key components, a robust community participation process, assessments of how local governments' past goals and actions have been successful or not in achieving those fair housing goals, analysis of current data and issues that impact fair housing, and establishing measurable fair housing goals and priorities. Both in this document will include both local and regional goals. And I think this is important to not too important to underscore that we've been very focused in this particular process on ensuring that data collection analysis will be tied in a direct way to remedy those findings. So next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview of the project timeline. It has been an eventful multi-year process, 25 years in the making. We have suffered some setbacks during the period of January 2018 to July 2020, which you just heard about, sort of describing those changes. But to credit to our local governments and our community partners in this region, everyone has decided to persevere and continue to conduct a regional assessment. And I'd like to sort of direct your attention to sort of where we are at the end of this arrow, which is that we're where we are right now. And I'll just really quickly recap the schedule when I'm concluded here to make sure that you have information about future opportunities to provide input on the draft plan. So next slide, please. So first, I want to just list who is participating in this process. We have eight of COG's member jurisdictions. You can see listed here in Northern Virginia. We have Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William, along with our public housing partners, also the District of Columbia, and in Maryland, Montgomery County, the District of Columbia. We have a HUD has actually been supportive throughout this entire process, been working directly with the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. We have a great team of consultants that are working with us as well to actually draft the plan. Ochoa Urban Collaborative, who's leading our community engagement process. Urban Institute's been our lead on data collection and analysis, and Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law is actually drafting the plan itself. Enterprise Community Partners has been working on behalf of HUD alongside us to help guide the Biden-Harris and administration on how we might want to inform the next iteration of the 2015 Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. Next slide, please. So another key group guiding the regional plan development is the Community Advisory Committee, and these groups, as shown here, represent regionally working organizations who serve residents impacted by fair housing choice. So the Advisory Committee's role is to provide input to the local governments and serve as a bridge to local communities throughout this process. And I want to publicly thank the NAACP Arlington County branch, as well as its other partner branches, the Equal Rights Center, and the other members of the Advisory Committee for their dedication and willingness to engage with COG and the jurisdictions to provide critical insights into this regional plan. And their ability to engage with communities in a different way than local governments is designed to ensure that we're doing everything we can to create a meaningful plan that responds to the realities that people face in metropolitan Washington. So next, I'll share a quick review of where what the plan is and where we are. So in the collaboration timeline. Next slide, please. So for the full regional plan, including draft regional goals and strategies for the local governments and for the region as a whole, should be available for public comment during April and May. Between now and April, local governments and COG Board of Directors will have an opportunity to sort of preview and react to some of those draft goals before they are shared widely. During June and July, after the public comment period has closed, we will incorporate those changes, revise the plan, and then begin all of the local government approval processes with the goal of submitting the final regional plan to HUD in July. So, but I wanted to make sure everyone is aware that the plan will be posted online on COG's website. The address is listed here on the side. It will also be on Arlington County's website, as well as all other public facilities where you would typically find these public plans. And I would really hope that all of you will take an opportunity to review the plan when it's published and provide comments and insights and make it better. So next slide just includes contact information if you have any other questions or want to reach out. So thank you again very much for your time and attention.
Good evening. My name is Marian Klunkowski, and I'm a member of the Arlington NAACP Education Committee. The following represents my research on U.S. school segregation and by turns school integration and how Arlington public schools stack up. Next slide, please. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ended legal segregation in U.S. public schools. But 68 years later, school segregation continues to divide us. Next slide, please. Project DAPS, Desegregating Arlington Public Schools, uses archival materials to chronicle APS's path and challenges to desegregate. Next slide, please. Until 1932, public education for people of color in Arlington was limited to primary school. They had to go to the District of Columbia to access public secondary education. And while in 1959, Arlington was the first county in Virginia to desegregate, desegregation is not integration. Next slide, please. So what's the difference? Desegregation is a legal or political process to end separating different racial and ethnic groups, whereas integration is a social process to provide members of different racial and ethnic groups fair and equal treatment in a desegregated environment and requires action beyond desegregation. Next slide, please. We know integration benefits children of all races. We know school and residential segregation are highly correlated. We know public schools educate the vast majority of our students, and it's where we have to focus our integration efforts. And we know in highly integrated school districts, individual schools reflect the demographics of the district as a whole. Next slide, please. We can consider some absolute measures, such as if white students comprise less than 10% of a school's enrollment, the school is considered intensely or hyper segregated. And we have one such school in Arlington, Carlin Springs Elementary School, where white students are 6% of enrollment. Also, if one race of students exceeds 75% in a school district, the district is not considered diverse. APS has historically been considered diverse. Next slide, please. And while it's useful, absolute measures don't always tell the whole story. Exposure and isolation rates measure peer interaction among students of different races and ethnicities and reveal white students are by far the most isolated group of students. And because white students are more exposed to Asian students and vice versa, some researchers use a binary categorical definition of race and ethnicity of Black and Hispanic when measuring integration. Next slide, please. And researchers also make a case for focusing integration efforts where inequities in student achievement have been documented. And this, again, is primarily among Black and Hispanic students. Next slide, please. I used APS's K through 12 civil rights statistics from September 30, 2021 to look at those schools which may contribute the most to school segregation in Arlington. Schools whose student enrollment varies significantly from APS's overall student demographics are noted here in bold red. And I used a metric of 50%. So if students of a particular category had a representation of 50% or below the overall student demographic, they're bolded. And likewise, if they have above 50% of the overall student demographic, they are red bolded. And you can see here that 8 elementary schools are noted for these disparities. And this information is available on APS's website, apsva.us, but you do have to put in the search menu statistics. It's not very readily available, in my opinion. Next slide, please. In terms of our middle schools, we have 2 schools and 1 high school, which may also be contributing significantly to district-wide segregation. Next slide, please. We know our neighborhoods tend to be racially segregated and drive a large share of observed school segregation. Determining which APS schools contribute the most to segregation or integration helps us better target our integration efforts. Next slide, please. And it's time to acknowledge we need a multi-pronged approach to integrating our schools, one which requires crafting and implementing a fair housing plan for Arlington County. I have my sources on the next slide. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marian. And I think now we're going to enter into our panel discussion. And so let me just quickly spotlight some of our panelists there. We got Samia and Michelle and Dr. Taylor. Just want to make sure that you guys can see everyone. My name is Colin Macbeth, and I am the Housing Committee Chair for the Arlington branch of the NAACP. And I will be moderating tonight's panel discussion. And I already mentioned her, but we have Samia Bird, who's the Chief Race and Equity Officer for Arlington County. We have Dr. Scott Edwin Taylor, who's the President of the Black Heritage Museum, and Michelle Winters, who's the former Executive Director of the Alliance for Housing Solutions and member of the Arlington NAACP Housing Committee. And I just want to add that the views expressed by the panelists are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the organizations with whom they are affiliated. So first, I wanted to ask a question for Samia. Samia, Arlington County is one of the wealthiest counties in the country, but that wealth and prosperity is not shared equally among its residents. Historical patterns of housing segregation and discrimination by private individuals and multiple levels of government have maintained a wealth, health, and opportunity gap between white residents and residents of color. How are the county's segregated neighborhoods connected to disparities in other areas for county residents, such as health outcomes, employment rates, and educational attainment?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Scott. I want to start by talking a little bit about and just give a little bit of data. So the getting ahead, the uneven opportunities landscape in Northern Virginia, as well as deeply rooted history's lessons for equity in Northern Virginia, both by the Northern Virginia Health Foundation, as well as for us, the county's race and ethnicity dashboard and our racial history timeline really helped to ground our understanding of equity, racial equity and disparities, and how the patterns of segregation in neighborhoods really historically impact all areas of a person's well-being and quality of life. And you may hear the term, the social determinants of health, and it's really like a compound effect of institutional structural racism, which is systemic. You may also hear like islands of disadvantage between communities at the census tract level throughout Northern Virginia, also identified in the Northern Virginia Health Foundation reports. And again, it's on our timeline and you can see it in our dashboard. And in Arlington, at the time of the report, the Northern Virginia Health Foundation Uneven Opportunities Landscape was, I think was 2017. They reported that there was a 10-year difference in life expectancy based on who you are and where you live in the county. Literally, your zip code or geographic location meant the difference between living 10 years longer. And the demographic of those areas of lower life expectancy aligned with the areas disproportionately represented by Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino or people of color, and those with low income. So a briefing paper that we have on our race and ethnicity dashboard and on our website, which I can share the link later, which when we can consider the wage gap in Arlington County, a disproportionate share of Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino people of color are in lower wage jobs, and they persist in Arlington as compared to white residents. Average wages lag behind white residents by more than half among Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, and people of color. White households represent about 3 out of every 4 households in Arlington County, yet only represent approximately half, or that's about 56% of households who earn less than $50,000. And then among white households, high income earners, which are those that make $200,000 or more, represent more households than any other income group. Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, and people of color disproportionately earn less than $100,000, which is a wage that cannot afford the median income in Arlington, median home, sorry, in Arlington. When we think about Black or African American, people of color, Hispanic or Latino people, almost 2 to 3 times times as likely as white residents to live below the federal poverty level and have 1 to 3% higher unemployment rates. Educational attainment, which we just heard a little bit about segregation in education. When we look at the rates by race and ethnicity, Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, and persons of color are nearly half as likely to graduate with a bachelor's degree than white residents. And these disparities persist race by race we have 22 different indicators that we report on our dashboard. And for me, there's no surprise or coincidence in this based on the fact that residential segregation persists with different racial ethnic groups concentrated in different neighborhoods in Arlington. And so in Arlington, from a housing perspective, we know 79% of all land zoned for residential development allows only single family detached housing as a matter of right. And areas of Arlington zone primarily for single family detached housing typically overlap with those census tracts where at least 70% of the population is white. Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, and people of color are much more likely than white residents to rent in the county. And renters are more likely to live in multifamily as opposed to that single family housing. And so we see Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, people of color, disproportionately concentrated in development corridors and other neighborhoods with a higher proportion of this housing type. So for what I really think about is us being able to acknowledge and understand the history and legacy of systemic racism and how our communities have developed, been built, as well as maintained for many decades. And not having access to housing or having your housing relegated to a certain location or type impacts access to education, wealth, health. When we talk about safety, transportation, how you experience open space and the environment, among other aspects of life. And so you need an address in a certain neighborhood to have access to a certain type of education, or that means you have then income, you can generate wealth, you can participate in the economy and live in certain areas that are deemed safe. For me, my background is in planning, and one of the things that interested me most in my studies was housing and community economic development, because for me, which is where I started my focus in my work, is a fundamental belief that where you live and access to housing or not impacts so much for a person's opportunities in life. And for me specifically, as a Black woman, I was more acutely aware that those opportunities were not afforded to everyone, and in particular, people who looked like or were similarly situated to me. And then not only access to decent and safe housing, but everything that together comprises a neighborhood, a community, and a community's economic and social status. So that's really the ability for everyone to thrive. So how many people, if given an opportunity, do and would determine where they live based on the quality of the schools in that area, or their access to transportation so that they can get to work or other means, or being able to access shopping or food or grocery stores or open space, or just wanting a safe environment and to feel secure. And notice I said opportunity, because many people do not have that opportunity because of the development and land use patterns codified as regulations and policies. And then just by habit of practice now, established decades ago, which, by the way, decades is really not that long of a time, relegated people to live in certain locations and types of housing, or simply denied people access based on who they were or were not, and based on a notion or idea of who should or should not have access. So again, we see that the disparities experienced by Black or African-American, Latino or Hispanic people of color, and others who were marginalized or disproportionately impacted is interrelated and connected, because systemic racism is inequities built into the structures and our systems.
Thank you, Sumia. That was a lot of information, and I appreciate how eloquently you presented that for everyone tonight. And I think it goes to show that we have a lot of work to do in Arlington to address these inequalities and the lack of equity. And I think that goes for our government as well as members of the whole community. I actually have a follow-up question for you. Specifically looking at segregation in Arlington County. So we have 20 civic associations where the Black population is less than 2%. That's despite the fact that the Black population in the county overall is actually closer to 10%. In these same neighborhoods, the white population is somewhere between 80% and 91%, depending on the specific civic association. What impact does this lack of neighborhood integration and diversity have on our community, and why should residents be concerned about it?
So we have to remember that there were efforts, as we just heard about, and we all know, I think, historically, to create and maintain homogeneous neighborhoods through practices like redlining, block busting, blacklisting, racialized zoning, exclusionary zoning, spot zoning, restrictive covenants and deeds, our mortgage lending and financing practices, which really did impact many neighborhoods throughout the country. And that pattern that you see today in Arlington is built on this legacy as well. And also people's beliefs, whether it's conscious or unconscious, about who should live where and in what types of housing and neighborhoods, and even who and who should not be neighbors. And so who is welcome into certain areas and neighborhoods, who can be displaced from established neighborhoods to make way for development and improvements, in which neighborhoods should there be investment. And the implication is that it continues to divide us, not only socially and in our interactions and connections as people, but also continues to further those gaps in education, in wealth, in our health, criminal justice and safety, the built and natural environment, even in our civic participation and involvement and engagement when we think about diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And we have to be able to understand and reconcile this thinking and this legacy to align with the thinking that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are not the problem or reason why neighborhoods cannot be nice or safe or invested in and resourced, but really, if included or allowed to enter into those spaces and places, to own homes, have access to those things just the same, I believe that it would increase economic wealth as well as the health of our communities, and really enrich and improve the value of our collective neighborhoods and communities and people's lives. And so if you think about it, when there are disparities in neighborhoods and communities, that means more resources should be put or need to be put into institutions of society that comprise the system, where we want to concentrate people based on their race or their income. And it costs us all, if you think about that, to bring those communities or neighborhoods to a place of stability or equilibrium. And since the starting point is not equal, likely we're really talking about equity, so a different starting point. And so the same case that is made to businesses in terms of the values proposition around diversity, inclusion, and equity, I think can be said and made of our neighborhoods. And I really appreciate a book by Heather McGee called The Sum of Us, as she talks about what racism costs all of us, and where there are equitable opportunities to access decent housing that is safe, same with healthcare, our jobs, shopping, parks, and open space, transportation and infrastructure in a community, quality education. This pays dividends for the entirety of a neighborhood. When there is not it costs more for people in the locality in terms of the needed investments, if you will, to make communities whole and people whole.
Thank you for that, Samia. And I think that data backs up what you said about the benefits of integration, not just to residents of color, but also to white residents. So the data basically says that you see improved educational attainment, employment rates, income earned, single versus two-parent families, as well as less polarization, higher public spending levels, and greater Black political efficacy in communities that have more integration. So I think there's benefits for the entire community and not just for residents of color from having more exposure and lived experience with each other. So thank you very much for that. So my next question, actually turning to Michelle. And so this is sort of reflecting on something we heard earlier tonight. So one of the presenters talked about how affordable housing and fair housing are often conflated by policymakers and members of the public. Why is it so important to understand the differences between these two policy areas? And what impact does it have on our communities when we mistake affordable housing programs for fair housing programs?
Oh, thank you for that question, Kellen. So these two housing goals are often not only conflated, but they also sometimes seem to be, they can seem to be in conflict with one another. I think it would be helpful to maybe explain by using an example that's relevant to Arlington. So if your policy goal is only to increase the amount of affordable housing units, the number of units, and you have a set amount of money to do that, presuming that it costs money to create those units, then your strategy is going to focus on creating those units primarily in places and in ways that you get the most bang for your buck in terms of the number of units. And that means that you're looking to minimize the cost of land, and the lowest cost of land is often in the least so-called opportunity-rich neighborhoods. Poor and minority neighborhoods have lower property values, so you build more affordable housing there. And wealthy white neighborhoods have higher property values, so those places look too expensive to build affordable housing. So if, on the other hand, you also have a policy goal of providing fair housing, you may need to make some decisions that will conflict with your original goal of maximizing the number of affordable units. So for example, buying land for affordable housing in North Arlington along or above Langston Boulevard is expensive. Property values are higher there, but through a fair housing lens, it should be seen as a necessary trade-off to make in order to have greater integration of affordable housing and the people of color and others who live in affordable housing throughout the community. So we may need to build more, overall fewer affordable housing units if it's going to cost us a little bit more to meet our fair housing goals. Or we should agree that as a community, that increased cost of an inclusive community is worth it and increase the resources that we put towards that solution, so that it's more than just achieving affordable housing as a simple number of units goal. I'll also say that, a fair housing strategy could be an integration or mobility strategy where you provide more access to opportunity by helping lower income and minority households move into wider areas. So that's that integration that we've talked about. But it really also should include the community development side of the equation. And that's ensuring that neighborhoods that do have higher concentrations of minorities and people of color have as much access to a high quality of life and opportunities as other areas. And it can't be an either or approach. You really need to include both strategies to have a complete fair housing strategy.
Thank you for that, Michelle. I think that distinction, as the question kind of set it up, is I think often missed by a lot of leaders throughout the country who look at the solution to a lot of our problems as solely affordable housing and forgetting the impact that those decisions can have on protected classes, historically marginalized communities, and how if you're going to do affordable housing the right way, you need to do it from an equity perspective and you need to do it from a fair housing perspective to make sure that you're not making segregation worse and a lot of these other disparities even worse, even as you're adding more affordable housing. So thank you for that. My next question is for Dr. Taylor. Arlington, like many communities around the country, has a dark history of forced racial segregation, displacement, and discrimination. What do you see as the continuing legacy of these discriminatory policies and actions in our communities as a lifelong resident of Arlington County?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, we were talking earlier about, I think JD was talking about, you know, the old way and what we're doing now. I have to go back to history, and there were Jim Crow laws. Now, those laws are not in effect now. They're illegal, but we're still suffering the backlash of those things. So there are still things that were put in place to keep us from really living here. So we were talking the other day about 2-3 family homes, how that is illegal here. That was done to keep Black people from coming up here in Arlington. A lot of families had to live too. And so, you know, I really believe that we need to take some of these things to a higher government. I think we're dependent so much on local government. It's going to take the federal government to come in and change some of these things, these zoning laws, these things that in a high-tech way are what is separating us. And it's going to take us getting organized and building coalitions all around the country to stop this. And you know, as Samir was saying, I mean, we're suffering. People need to get together, and I totally, you know, believe that there are just that sector of people that don't want Black and white together because it's just too much power. And so I'm just hoping that we taking heed to what's going on, and after we get enough knowledge, let's organize and quell this. It can be done.
I definitely agree with you there that, you know, a unified approach and involving all levels of government is absolutely key to making progress on these really critical issues. I have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Taylor, you know, kind of about some of your lived experience and what you've seen in Arlington, you know, over the years. So specifically, you know, what type of discrimination or segregation have you seen or even experienced in Arlington County?
You want to know how old I am? I mean, it was a lot.
In the last 2 decades.
My mom and dad lived 1 block from Arlington Hospital, and they could not have me at Arlington Hospital. Things like that. I remember the Buckingham Theater when we could not, you know, go there. Could not swim in Arlington. I remember all those things. I remember my dad coming home when they had the lunch counter sit-ins, and he worked at People's Drugstore, and they told him to take off all of the stools so the people wouldn't sit there. I mean, I remember all of that. I remember being able to shop at stores, but mom couldn't return anything or try anything on. And I remember the segregation wall, which I'm gonna do a plug here. I have a children's book about that. There was a segregation wall in Arlington. And the book is about the day that me and some friends climbed that wall and saw, you know, a whole new world. So, yeah, I've seen a lot of it, but these neighborhoods now are integrated. There's going to be change. There's going to be gentrification. That's understandable. But all people have got to be in the plan and in the vision. And so that's what I'm fighting for and hoping for. And it's not going to happen unless we all get together. I mean, I show pictures down here at the museum of the lunch counter sit-ins. I have a picture of Miss Ham protesting in front of Buckingham Theater. If you look at the protesters, they're Black and white. It just wouldn't work if it was all Black. It wouldn't work if it was all white. It has to be people of all colors, especially Black and white, banding together, getting organized, and making the change, demanding the change. We have power on the streets. I mean, we have our politicians, but we're the ones who put them there, and we have to utilize our power.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. I think that's a super powerful point, that, the fight is not over. And I think that's one of the key messages that we want, especially attendees from this event, to take home, is that this did not stop with the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. This didn't stop in the 70s, didn't stop in the 80s. This fight continues because we're still dealing with additional discrimination. We're dealing with the effects of this discrimination and the segregation in our communities today. As Samia brought up, it's affecting life expectancies in different neighborhoods. Some, residents of color live 10 years less, living in a neighborhood right across from another neighborhood where they live 10 years longer, and they're mostly white.
Right.
That's today. That's not, 1968.
Exactly.
So,
unless you said it wasn't that long ago, and we have to do something about this this NIMBYism. That's a big thing. A lot of people, don't want this in my backyard. So we're dealing with the NIMBYism and people just taking things out of context, like affordable housing. I mean, I used that term a couple of years ago, and I was, sort of almost beat up. They're saying, when you say affordable housing, people are thinking about projects, and that is not what they're talking about, but people have a way of turning the information around. And that's why we have to continue getting the information out. I'm so glad you're having this forum to get the information what these things really mean. I'm all for rent control. I mean, if they controlled the rent, they would build more houses. If you build more houses, they're cheaper. So it's a lot of things that we can do if we fight for them and make people know this is what we want. We want to integrate. We need to bring Black businesses here. And of course, I'm for reparations too, because I'm saying, because of Jim Crow, we didn't get that head start. We're trying to catch up, and it's hard to catch up. So we may need additional help. Reparations could be something like that with housing, so that our kids can live and be happy, and our communities can be more healthy.
thank you, Dr. Taylor. So you brought up a number of, potential solutions to address some of these issues. And that actually, I think, is a good segue into my next question for Michelle. Samia talked about the income and wealth gaps between white residents and residents of color, specifically Black residents, being very high disparities. And you also see that related to home ownership rates as well in the community. So what can the county do, or what should it be doing to ensure that Black and brown households have access to the wealth building power that comes from home ownership?
Okay, another good question. So, Arlington County does have a home ownership program, a low-income home ownership program, a moderate income home ownership program. They support housing counseling and education. But really, these programs are run in good faith, but they are really not substantial enough to be having the impact that they need to have. I think one of the words that I jotted down when we were talking earlier about affirmatively furthering fair housing was the term meaningful actions. And I don't think that the way that our homeownership assistance programs are structured right now in Arlington can really be called meaningful in the way that they are dealing with some of the homeownership gaps that we do have. So Arlington County does have a down payment assistance program called MyPAP. It really only serves MyPAP. It's an acronym, stands for Moderate Income Purchase Assistance Program. It only serves a handful of people a year. And in addition to a lack of funding, which obviously, if there was more funding that could serve more people, one of the challenges, particularly with regard to fair housing that it runs into, is that there aren't enough available and affordable condo units, because condos are basically all you can afford at that income level around here, at the right price point, at the right and at the right features, with the right features. It's especially true when you consider the fair housing goals and providing access to housing throughout the community, not just in places where the prices are the lowest. And so I saw somebody put in the chat earlier on, sort of reading the tea leaves, that the reason that that's the case is because the zoning in our community dictates very strongly what kind of housing we can have in what areas of the county. And so looking at trying to diversify the type of housing that we allow in those different areas would go a long way to allowing some of that integration to occur that we're looking for. And the tool that the county is currently looking at to do that is casually called the Missing Middle Housing Study. I think they've got a new name for it now, looking at new housing options. But it's looking at zoning tools to increase the ability to provide different housing types and sizes and price points all throughout Arlington. That is definitely an essential part, but it's not going to be enough. And I think we need to be really clear about that, that on their own, the types of zoning reforms that they may come forward with, they will help the private market create naturally lower cost units in more places throughout the county. I mean, that's the goal of the study. But the county does need to do some things that support that policy with regard to fair housing and housing equity. So the county needs to include in its strategy an incentive and programmatic component that helps enable as many as possible of those new units to be attainable for lower and moderate income households who are more likely to be people of color. They can get creative with eligibility for those programs. So that would be perhaps a homeownership assistance program targeted towards units that are in missing middle housing. Evanston, Illinois, for instance, they recently created a reparations assistance, homeownership assistance program targeted at descendants of people who had lived in segregated neighborhoods in Evanston in the past. So that's a direct tie to some of the discrimination in the past and the segregation that the affirmatively furthering fair housing is supposed to be addressing. So along with the zoning forms that they're evaluating, they really need to include that stepped up, some form of stepped up homeownership assistance program and other targeted incentives. Another thing that they can do that's a part of this, and I've already seen this in the chat as well, so we're a little bit aligned and that's great, is that the county can do more than it is right now to help produce permanently affordable homeownership through community land trusts. So this could be a part of the zoning reform that they're working on, or it could be a separate thing. And there's a number of ways to do it. So what is a community land trust? A CLT is basically a nonprofit organization that shares ownership of a housing unit with the household that is the homeowner. So that shared ownership of that housing unit, basically the CLT owns the land and the homeowner owns the unit. That helps make ownership of that unit so much more affordable than it would be otherwise. But it also creates stability in the housing price, the future price of that housing. So that homeowner can gain equity by paying down their mortgage, and through the amount of equity that they are gaining over time. But they've agreed when they bought that home that they'll sell it to a person that is also meeting the same income, lower income, moderate income limitations. So this is a way of recycling subsidies so that that nonprofit can continue to use that subsidy and provide that permanent homeownership over time. And this is a really helpful fair housing tool because they not only let people build wealth as homeowners, they help create and maintain a mixed income community in the long run by keeping specific housing units permanently affordable, no matter what's going on in the real estate market around them. So we know that the way that the real estate market works is it's a balloon that's hard to control. You try to push it down over here and it'll pop up over there. And if everything is allowed to rise to the market rate price, then that's what will happen. And so things like these community land trusts and nonprofit ownership are ways to keep a certain portion of the units at a moderate income level that can be accessible to people with lower and moderate incomes. There's a criticism of that, by the way, for some people who think, oh, well, that's not allowing a homeowner to get the full appreciation from being a homeowner. And my argument to that is that the level of income, the households that should be eligible for these types of programs are not people who would otherwise be homeowners. These are families and individuals who would otherwise be renting. And the only person gaining, the main person gaining wealth in a renting situation is the landlord. So if you put that same household in a situation where they're a community land trust homeowner, they are gaining wealth over time. And then when they are ready to move on, say into an unsubsidized homeownership situation, they're able to do that. They can help reduce displacement of low and moderate income households as well. So that's another thing that we should be looking at. So for instance, are CLTs an option for using in some of our historically African-American communities? Maybe they should have been decades ago before we had so much displacement in those communities. Perhaps it's not too late to work on some of that.
Michelle, and I had a quick follow-up conversation or question for you. And I know we're getting short on time for this panel. But so specific to some of the zoning topics that you brought up. So in 2021, the city of Boston enacted an affirmatively furthering fair housing amendment to their zoning code to overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. Basically, it integrated research, public engagement, and action planning into the development approval process to ensure that future developments prioritize the needs of historically marginalized communities. Do you think Arlington County would benefit from a policy like this, and how would they begin to incorporate these principles into our zoning code? If you're able to answer that in a minute or two, that would be great.
So I'll keep it really short, which is just to say that everybody's learning a lot about what Boston has done. They are the first, I believe, in the country to have included fair housing concepts specifically in their zoning code language. So it's definitely innovative. I think that if Boston's doing it, we should totally have that kind of thinking on the table for us. I also, looking into it a little bit, I see that it does have a pretty strong anti-displacement component to it, where every development is required, or every development that goes through that process is required to look at what the displacement impacts are going to be and then to mitigate them. And so that is certainly something that we would benefit from. I mean, we have, active situations that we have no tools to really deal with, such as the situation going on in Columbia Pike right now. And we definitely need more tools at our disposal to deal with displacement pressures. Unfortunately, and all about this, Kellen, in the state of Virginia, our hands are tied and on a lot of these things, and we need to do a lot of work at the state level to try to get some of the powers that we need.
Thank you, Michelle. And I have one last question for Samia. And so as we wrap up the panel discussion, I wanted to ask, as the county works to finalize its fair housing plan this spring, why is it so important that the county take a collaborative approach to addressing fair housing issues, which would include working with multiple departments and Arlington Public Schools to address longstanding inequities?
So can I just quickly say first, I'm really still struck by what Dr. Taylor said about climbing the wall and being exposed to a whole new world, like experiencing a whole new world. That just really stuck with me. Sorry. So anyway, similar to the points that Michelle made about really having multiple tools and a number of different things and strategies, I think the same thing applies when we talk about our plan, right? And when we talk about who is going to be implementing, executing, developing. Equity has to be everyone's job. And this is at a department level, an institutional level, meaning the county and schools, as well as individuals and people within the community. And that goes back to, I think, some of the comments I made earlier about everything being so interconnected within the system. So So it has to be everyone's job, and everyone has to come together to focus on solutions, to focus on ways that we might address it and approach it and implement once we have those solutions. I am appreciative, and I appreciate also the consideration of this work from a regional approach, and focusing on what Hillary Chapman shared earlier. And I'm looking forward to a presentation in our Chief Equity Officers Committee, I think next week, on the same, on the housing equity plan. But, you know, given the interconnectedness of people and the issues of fair housing across jurisdictions, and an approach at many levels of government is needed. So all disciplines will be needed. So interdisciplinary and multifaceted approach that involves everyone to address the legacy that we have all inherited.
Well, thank you very much, Samia, and our other panelists, Dr. Taylor and Michelle, for your enlightening remarks. I thought that was a great discussion, and you guys were able to highlight a lot of the key things that not only the Arlington NAACP is working to advance solutions for these issues, but I think there's a lot of other groups, both locally in Arlington, regionally in the DC metro area, and throughout the state, who are pushing for more focus on how equity meaningfully gets integrated into these policies, not as a buzzword, but with actual commitment of dollars, commitment of resources to doing the hard work to ensure that all of our policies and programs are looking at what is the impact of this on different protected classes and different historically marginalized communities. And if there's going to be a unequal impact, then let's look at changing the policy instead of just saying, well, what can we do? That's just what it is. So I definitely appreciate that. And with that, I think we can go into the Q&A session. So thank you guys again. So just so everyone is aware, you can either add questions in the chat, and I will do my best to see them and raise them, and feel free to ask questions of any of the people who have spoken, not just our panelists. And also, if you guys raise your hand using that feature, I can also call on people to ask their questions directly, and you guys could come off mute when I call on you for that. So with that said, do we have any questions from people who want to ask live for, again, any of the presenters or the panelists? If not, I'll go to the first question we had in the chat. Okay, I will go to the first question. Oh, Michael Heminger, you have your hand raised.
Hey, good evening. Thanks, Helen. And thank you, panelists, for being with us tonight. I sit on the Housing Commission, and one of the things that keeps me up at night is just committed affordable units. We get these really expansive properties and campuses that have hundreds and hundreds of units in them, but we might be lucky to get maybe 8 committed affordable units. In the way that we do affordable housing, as I'm sure you know, I feel like we really concentrate all of our lower income people into the same neighborhoods and the same schools. And I wonder if you have any potential solutions that we could work on to try to get away from that.
Who wants to take that? Okay.
I mean, I can go with that. So there's a number of tools. I mean, the only thing that's in place right now is that when the county allocates its Affordable Housing Investment Fund money, it gives extra points for certain areas that are a higher priority for trying to get additional housing, affordable housing units. And it gives lower points for the areas that already have a large number of affordable housing units. So in the end, that is really kind of not really addressing the systemic issue that we have, which is that we only allow multifamily housing units to exist in certain parts of the county. And the affordable units in particular are very concentrated. I think we have a couple of really key opportunities. And one is the missing middle housing study that I mentioned. Obviously, you know, that is just the small scale. Missing middle housing is a very small scale type of housing. And that should be happening everywhere around the county. There shouldn't be any areas of the county that are off limits to the zoning reforms that might come out of that study. So that's a key issue. The other is big planning processes. Another one that is happening right now that you may have heard of is Plan Langston Boulevard. So there's a process to take a look at the plan that is a new revised plan for all the development all up and down Langston Boulevard. And one of the big challenges in that is trying to take a look at it and say, okay, well, the south side of the county has Columbia Pike and a lot of multifamily housing on Columbia Pike and all along. You know, what if we had a mirror and had something similar in the north part of the county so that we had more balance? That is going to be very challenging. We need people to support that kind of development. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are involved in the planning process who are not comfortable with that level of density. And they are speaking very, very loudly at the community meetings. And so I would say, and this is a plan, by the way, a draft plan is going to be released in the next couple of months. And people who are, you know, very supportive of increasing diversity in the northern half of the county really need to be present at those meetings and make their voices heard, because that's a major opportunity for the county for the next 30 to 50 years, I think.
Thank you, Michelle. Marion, is there anything you wanted to add to that? And you certainly don't have to.
I just think that the research that was from the Urban Institute, the idea of really focusing on where the problem is the greatest, and obviously it is in Northern Arlington. And so that's all I can say. I mean, it's just sort of a roadmap, maybe where to start, and use that as justification for why all of this is necessary. I'm learning about the fair housing and the affordable housing issue, and this has been very helpful this evening. But I think in terms of the schools, I was actually quite shocked at some of the disparities among different student groups within our Northern Arlington schools, even as I know there's that north-south divide in the schools, just as there is everywhere else. So.
Thank you, Marion. So I had a question from the chat from Adam Theo, who asked, what role and powers could Arlington County have in actively investigating discrimination in our affordable housing program, not county-owned public housing, but run through subsidized nonprofits? Is there anyone who wants to take that?
So I think, you know, we haven't really talked about the investigation and discrimination and complaint process in Arlington. And we've got some really good, the earlier panelists, I would ask Kellen if we could maybe hear a little bit about what the, what is the discrimination and complaint process in Arlington, and how does that compare to what happens at the state level or what happens in DC? You know, are we doing a good job?
So Regina and Susie, are either of you comfortable with that? I know the NAACP has done a considerable amount of research into this area too, and I'm happy to take a stab at that as well. We included a number of recommendations to county leadership about how to fix a number of issues that we identified in the fair housing enforcement process in Arlington. But if you guys wanted to jump in first on that, happy to have you speak.
Helen, can you repeat the question one more time?
Yes. What role and powers could Arlington County have in actively investigating discrimination in our affordable housing program? And then parentheses, not county-owned public housing, but run through subsidized nonprofits.
Got it. So I think there's many avenues that investigations could occur, but generally speaking, privately owned housing. One opportunity that you can use to identify possible discrimination is testing, which I discussed earlier. By the way, sorry, this is Susie. I know I'm not Penn, but this is Susie at the Equal Rights Center. So testing is a good tool for identifying discrimination in the private market to get a better idea as to what's going on throughout the, a jurisdiction. Within Arlington, if someone experiences discrimination, we can help that person file a complaint with the Virginia Fair Housing Office, which is the statewide government agency that investigates cases of housing discrimination. So for instance, we had a client a couple years ago in Arlington who a landlord texted her thinking that he was texting the current tenant. And he said, I don't want to rent to her. I think she's African. And, only because she got that text message did she know the reason that the landlord didn't want to engage with her. So we helped her file a complaint with the Virginia Fair Housing Office. They investigated and found probable cause of discrimination. And the landlord actually refused to settle. And so it's currently a lawsuit filed by the Office of Attorney General that is still undergoing litigation. So I don't know if that provides some background. I know that NAACP Arlington also has some very specific recommendations as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Susie. And I'm happy to give some information about that as well, because we didn't focus a lot on Arlington's specific fair housing enforcement process. So the Office of Human Rights within Arlington County, under the Human Rights Ordinance, enforces fair housing complaints, as well as public accommodation and employment discrimination complaints. So Arlington's code is different from the state code. For example, some of the protected classes don't exist in Arlington. So source of funds, the county board has not added that to our code. So currently Arlington County staff do not investigate or enforce any complaints of source of funds discrimination in Arlington. Why that's the case, that's a really good question for the county board to answer. But that's not a change that they've added, and that's existed in Virginia since 2020. Virginia also has military status as a protected class. Arlington has also not added that as a protected class to our human rights ordinance. So it's not enforced locally, although it's still enforced at the state and HUD, not HUD, but at the state level within Arlington. Additionally, we have a lot of key vacancies within the Office of Human Rights, which restricts their ability to handle caseloads and handle complaints because we're missing investigators. Our definitions of protected classes are not the same as the definitions used at the state level, which I think is confusing for people because it means that it's not the same protected class as what we have that under federal law or under state law in a number of cases. And there's also the process that Arlington uses if conciliation. So basically, if they get a complaint, they investigate, staff determines whether or not they think that there's basically the violation reasonably occurred. And then they enter into this negotiation process between the claimant and the landlord or the property owner who allegedly committed the violation to see if they can come to some sort of agreement. If that fails, they have the option of going to court. In Arlington, the county board actually has to approve going to court, which is a really odd feature of our law because it politicizes that process. Instead of having it be, staff have apolitically determined that this violation reasonably occurred, so let's sue and have the courts decide. You have the county board who has to make that determination whether or not they want it to go to court, which again, that's an opportunity for the different parties to lobby the board as elected officials, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that doesn't exist at the state level and certainly not at the federal level. Arlington also doesn't have the full enforcement powers that the state has. So for instance, Arlington can't accept anonymous complaints for fair housing violations. So if I were to go and say, hey, I heard that there were fair housing issues or this type of discrimination happening at this building, Arlington can't investigate. They would say, I'm sorry, I need someone who's actually experienced discrimination to come and file a complaint. And we know that there's barriers, especially for low-income people and people whose immigration status, is less than certain to engage in, filing complaints or coming forward like that. And so it creates kind of additional barriers to resolving these issues when the county can't just go in and investigate based on anonymous complaints. The county also doesn't investigate pattern and practice and disparate income complaints, whereas the state does. So the state will look at, multiple cases overall. And you saw this with the Attorney General's office recently opening an investigation into the Serrano Apartments allegations of discrimination. That's not something that Arlington County has the power to do under their current ordinance. So there's a number of areas where I would argue that Arlington residents, if they go through the county process, are going to get a less helpful process to enforce their fair housing rights than they would get by going to HUD or going to the state. And that's something that the Arlington NAACP has come out and asked the county to make this change. That's been endorsed by the Human Rights Commission of Arlington as well. So we're kind of waiting on the county to take action. And I say waiting, we're looking for the county to take action on that. But those are some of the current areas where we see some disparities in Arlington's process and the process under HUD and the state level.
I have a question, Kellen. I guess I'm not understanding why other information is not provided to residents. I mean, such as, home and Equal Rights Center. I mean, for folks to have that information, because just because Arlington County doesn't do it doesn't mean that those same folk could not come through home to assist with the discriminatory allegations.
I think that's a good question. I know the Equal Rights Center has taken cases in Arlington. I don't know how frequently Home has taken cases here, but that's certainly something that moving forward, and part of having you guys co-sponsor this is that, we want people to be aware that Home and ERC are a resource for people experiencing housing discrimination issues. And, I think certainly we want to work with the county as well to ensure that on their public facing information, their website, and other resources provided and training to tenants, that they let them know that they have these resources available in Home and ERC to help them, if they do feel that they're the victim of this type of discrimination.
So it sounds like that Home needs to certainly investigate or work toward a heavier presence in Arlington County so that people will know that we're here, because that's disturbing what you just said.
We would love to have Home be as active as they would like to be in Arlington County. We're more than happy to have as many players in the fair housing space as we can get, because, the example that Susie brought up, the discrimination is very real, and it may be, 2022. I think that case was maybe a year or two ago when it was initiated, but we still see racist discrimination happen in Arlington, that people saying, I do not want to rent to someone based on their race or national origin, or, a lot of the other protected classes. Arlington is not immune to that discrimination or that racism. We have it. But it is not something that, in my view, we've really proactively addressed. And I think we've seen that too in our testing, which is fairly sporadic. Every couple years, Arlington County does third-party testing, and they only do it for 2 of the protected classes. They've done it for race and national origin, I think in the last 10 years. They've only done it 3 times. So that means all the other protected classes, we don't do third-party testing in Arlington. So we don't have any way to proactively, try and address those issues. Not that we don't have any way. We have not utilized the tools that we could be using to do that. So that's another thing that the Arlington NAACP has called on the county to step up its testing, and not just restrict it to the same 2 categories that it's used for, the last 10 years or so. So that's something that we definitely think is critically important, because we know this discrimination is happening. because it's happening everywhere in the United States. And it's a continuing problem. And I think the attitude that we sometimes hear is, well, we haven't been getting many complaints, so it must not be an issue here. That's not how this works. And we know that people they don't understand their rights. And even if they do, there's a lot of barriers to seeking enforcement because they're afraid of retaliation, which is a real thing. And they're afraid of, a lot of potential things that can happen because we're talking about their home. We're talking about access to, safe, stable living environment. And people don't want to do things that they feel like will jeopardize that, even if they feel like they're the victim of discrimination. And that's why we need, the state and local government to step up and be much stronger partners with our most vulnerable residents to ensure that, they don't have to be afraid of speaking out and saying, hey, my rights have been violated. Can someone please do something to help me?
Well, actually, I certainly look forward to having more conversation with you, Kelly, and folks on your team.
So I have a question that I'd like to bring in here, and it's related to the regional plan that Hillary discussed. So it looks like we're going to have a very interesting regional plan to look at, and that there will be local components of that plan. How does that plan relate to Arlington County's own fair housing plan that it has to adopt according to whatever HUD rules and expectations, and what are the opportunities within our local plan to address some of these issues that are being highlighted tonight?
So happy to jump in. The regional plan will include Arlington County's specific goals and strategies. So each of the 8 jurisdictions will have their own local goals and strategies, and Arlington goals will be placed in the context of the region. So you'll be able to see what is publicly supported housing? How does Arlington County's housing compare to the region? It won't be compared against these 8 jurisdictions, but sort of the region as a whole. Now, there will also be an overarching set of regional goals, and all of the jurisdictions that are part of this plan will adopt them in addition to Arlington specific and local goals and strategies. So there'll be sort of, and some of those local goals, some of those regional goals will be replicated at the local level in Arlington specific ways. But we hope that we will also see specific goals and strategies that are unique to Arlington, and hoping that everyone here and your neighbors will look at those when it comes out, to inform what you think Arlington County should be doing as part of this plan.
And so I'll just say that my my understanding of these things, is that in the past, the plans, and we've addressed a lot of this tonight, so I just wanted to kind of underscore it, that the fair housing plans in the past, especially prior to the publication of the 2015 Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule, really were almost entirely focused on the direct acts of discrimination. So that there wasn't anything, or there wasn't as much or hardly any attention to the more systemic issues that are part of disparate impacts that we've talked about, and the affirmatively furthering. So what I was saying before is those meaningful actions at integration, and that the integration component of things really hasn't been a focus. So can we expect integration among protected classes to be a much bigger component of these future plans than we had in the past?
So those goals and strategies are being drafted as we speak, and I think that we can expect to see more goals along those that are, I think, more aligned with the affirmatively furthering part that we've been discussing this evening. So I think all of this input here has been very helpful. I've been taking lots of notes as we're going, and we'll share it with the author of the team that's writing the plan itself. But certainly, I would anticipate the goals to not only build on what Arlington County has done in the past, but to also include new ways to affirmatively further fair housing in the county.
And I'm sorry, and Hillary is,
Go ahead.
and then I know I'll learn more about this later, but just in thinking about all the different intersections, if you will, of housing in other areas. And I know that COG has really been taking a broader approach around equity and equity emphasis areas and looking at housing and then the environment. Do you see or anticipate that there will be some of those connections there to kind of address more holistically, I guess, some of the inequities and how housing is integrated into those different inequities?
Absolutely. That's a great question, Samia. I think not every goal and strategy in this plan actually is going to be housing related. I think we're going to see goals related to transportation. We'll see goals related to education. Probably the majority will be housing, but not all of them will be specifically about housing.
Thank you for that, Hillary. So I think I saw Tim Dempsey had quite a few questions in the chat, and I was wondering, Tim, did you want to pick probably one of them in the last couple of minutes to ask for any of the speakers or panelists? And it's possible that he is not in a position where he's able to ask one of them, but okay, one of the questions, sorry, he's responding in the chat. So one of the questions that he'd asked was about public housing in Arlington. So Arlington County specifically does not have a public housing authority like many other jurisdictions within the state. So they do have one from HUD's perspective, but not from the state perspective. And the main consequence of that is that Arlington County legally cannot own and operate public housing. And so I think Tim's question was, why can't we revive publicly owned housing to build new mixed income rental buildings that are net zero? Let's not forget about climate change in these discussions. Arlington can form a housing authority and pass a bond to do that. Isn't the point that we cannot rely on capitalist housing markets to fix this problem? Housing is a human right, not a commodity, or should be. Do we have anyone who wants to take a stab at answering that question?
Oh, you picked a fun one. So that's true. Arlington does not have public housing. The county leaders made a decision, almost 100 years ago, I guess, in the beginning, to not have a public housing authority. Back when HUD was allowing those to be created all around the country, or the predecessor to HUD was allowing that to happen. And then HUD stopped funding the creation of new public housing in the 80s, I believe, if I'm getting my history right. So if we were to come around and say right now, we change our mind, we want to do public housing, there wouldn't be any resources for that from the federal government, from HUD, as it is right now, that would help create more affordable housing than we're able to create through the current system that we do have. So we focus on, we have our inclusionary programs that have these, tiny number of units that are developed inside a for-profit, high-rise in Roslyn. But most of our affordable housing units come from our investments from our Affordable Housing Investment Fund, and are created by nonprofit owners that are in the county and that compete for those funds through a NOFA, a notice of funding availability process. So it's a competitive process. The county can pick and choose who it does its business with. So I think it's not clear that there would be any specific benefit to having public ownership and management, even if we were went in and got the approval to allow us to do that. So I mean, my focus is looking at nonprofits and trying to get nonprofits to be the stewards, long-term stewards of our affordable housing. And I think that's the direction that the country is going, is moving away from public ownership and into nonprofit ownership. I think one of the things that we've seen, though, is that when we do that, we have to make sure that we don't lose track of the oversight responsibilities that the public sector should have over those investments. And so it's kind of complex. So in other words, I don't know that there would be a benefit to Arlington to having a housing authority right now. There could be a benefit to having the ability to, or the tendency and ability to buy and hold land as a part, sort of like a land banking strategy, to then have developer partners build on, so that the county is like owning the land and then the builders build on top of it, so that way the county can always control what's going to happen with that land in the future and never sort of can lose sight of it or lose its control over it. So that's what they did in Arlington Mill, where they created, it was a community center property, or they created the community center and they leased the space behind the community center to create affordable housing with APA. So they can and should be doing that in many more areas around the county, again, through desegregation goals. I think I saw for the first time recently a proposal or an idea that the county wanted to potentially co-locate a library and affordable housing. And again, the county wouldn't be operating the housing, they would be working with a partner and then overseeing that partner. So that's more of the best practice for that.
Thank you for that, Michelle. And I know we have about 2 minutes left. So I just wanted to thank all of our speakers and panelists for providing the wealth of information tonight. And hopefully our attendees and guests learn something from this. And hopefully they're going to walk away from this and understand that, you know, fair housing is often undervalued policy area, but it's really critical to fighting or righting the wrongs of private and government sponsored discrimination that have stained our residential neighborhoods to this day. And I wanted to give a quick plug to the Arlington NAACP as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the NAACP has sent Arlington County a number of recommendations on fair housing to address a lot of the issues that were brought up tonight. And that includes completing a housing equity assessment that would look at all of the programs and policies that the county currently has around housing and look at how do they impact historically disadvantaged populations within our community, and are the benefits of these programs and policies, are they disproportionately, one group of people versus another, and do we need to address that and look at that? Because if you're going to make changes, it's important to look at what are we doing today and how equitable are our current and existing policies and programs as we look at potentially adding new ones. And also, as part of that, funding fair housing staff position within the Department of Community Planning and Housing Development to ensure that this is a key focus when it comes to decisions around site plan, zoning, any of the housing initiatives, that someone is looking at it from an equity perspective, from a fair housing lens, so that that does not get lost as the county is trying to make these decisions. And we also recommended that they increase the frequency and breadth of fair housing testing. We touched on that earlier, as well as change the fair housing enforcement structure. We talked about that. expand homeownership support for non-white residents, and specifically for our Black and Brown residents who typically in the county have lower incomes and can use a lot more support to ensure that they're able to enjoy the benefits of home ownership that a lot of our white residents have enjoyed for generations. We also requested that the county expand fair housing training, both for residents and for county staff, to ensure that people really understand these issues. They know what their rights are, and they know if they hear about potential discrimination, who to contact, how to address them, and what the remedies are for them. And then lastly, we recommended that they develop metrics, they identify interagency collaboration needs, and focus on areas of concentrated poverty in the revised fair housing plan. So as part of the regional analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, we asked that the county really focus on developing a plan that's going to have public goals that everyone can track and measure progress against. And then it's going to focus on the areas that are most in need and target those areas within our community. And then lastly, just sort of the call to action for everyone. If you join this event, hopefully it's because this is an area that's important to you and you care about. But we want you to, when the regional analysis of impediments to fair housing choice comes out in April, we want you to read it. We want you to comment, because we want to have as much pressure and advocacy for either strengthening that, depending on how it comes out, or just to implement the recommendations that come out from that and let the county leadership know that this is important for our community. Also, please consider joining the Arlington NAACP. We could always use more advocates for fair housing policies, and we'd love to have you guys join if you're not already members. And lastly, learn more about fair housing. You can attend a free training hosted by the Virginia Office of Fair Housing to learn more about residents' rights as well as property owners' responsibilities. And the more that people understand these topics and these areas, the better they're able to advocate for them and help ensure that all of our rights are actually respected, and people can live dignified lives in safe and affordable properties in Arlington. So with that, President Spain, did you have any closing remarks?
Yes, final remarks, and I won't be long. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to our chair of the Housing Committee, Mr. Kellen Macbeth. Please, everyone, take your bow, Kellen. And to all of our panelists tonight, Holmes, Susie with ERC, Judith, Hillary, Regina, Michelle, Dr. Taylor, Samia Bird, my classmate in Leadership Arlington 2022. We meet tomorrow. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I have no more to say except, this battlefield for social justice and civil rights is not over. We are not waving the flag of surrender here at the NAACP, and we need all hands on deck. We brought the experts here, but we need your help, all right? So again, this is a long battle. We know there are systemic issues, policy issues that need to be changed. And for some odd reason or another, we can't find the leaders with the right level of courage to step out and change them. But we're going to challenge them, because our duty here at the NAACP is to agitate and get in good trouble. So that's what we do, right? With that being said, again, thank you for showing up tonight. Madam Secretary, I know you're working them slides behind the scenes and doing everything. Thank you for your time. Kellen, back over to you for really the complete closeout, because this is your event. Back to you, sir.
I said my closing remarks, so thank you, JD. Double thank you to everyone that you thanked. Really appreciate all of our speakers, panelists, our secretary, JD, and our full housing committee for the Arlington NAACP for all the help to pull this off and put this together. So thank you all, and thank you again to all of our attendees for joining us tonight. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we'll continue to reflect on what you've heard tonight and consider the role that you can play to advance equity and advance integration within our community. So thank you all again. Have a good night.